It was supposed to be a routine interview, a gotcha moment staged in the hollowed out carcass of American industry. It became the day a television anchor's carefully laid trap was dismantled by a single, unscripted act of defiance that gave a voice back to the forgotten men and women of a nation. The air inside Air Force One was still and pressurized, a sterile tube hurtling through the stratosphere toward the rust-colored fields of Ohio. President Donald J. Trump sat not in the command center, but in a quiet, wood-paneled office, the drone of the engines a distant hum. Across from him, his son, Barron, tall and observant, watched as his father stared at a photograph, its edges softened by time. It wasn't a state document or a classified briefing, but a simple black and white picture from another era. In it, a younger, formidable Fred Trump stood shoulder to shoulder with a line of men in dusty work boots and hard hats, their faces etched with the pride of builders, the sun-creased smiles of men who made things with their hands. The president tapped the glass. "You see that, Baron," he said, his voice softer than the world was used to hearing. "That's not about money. It's not about a deal. That's about respect. Your grandfather knew their names. He knew their families. They weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were building something together. That's what they've forgotten. They talk about the economy, but they forget about the work." He placed the photo back in his breast pocket, a piece of personal history nestled against his heart, a silent promise he carried with him as the plane began its descent. The factory was a cathedral of decay. Light struggled through grime-caked windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the dead air. The silence was the loudest thing in the room, broken only by the echoing footsteps of the presidential entourage on the cracked concrete floor. At the center of this industrial graveyard, Jake Tapper and his CN crew had set up their lights, creating a harsh, artificial island of television reality. Tapper, sharp and composed, radiated an air of surgical precision. This was his arena. He had the president on his turf, surrounded by the very failure he intended to pin on him. The cameras rolled. "Mr. President," Tapper began, his voice smooth and accusatory, "the latest non-farm payroll figures show a significant cooling in the manufacturing sector, and your own treasury projections suggest a revised, lower GDP growth for the next quarter. Given these metrics, how can you tell the people here?" He never finished the question. The president wasn't looking at him. His gaze had drifted past the lights, past the cameras, to a small group of men standing in the shadows. They wore faded union jackets and expressions of weary resignation. They were the ghosts of this place. With a look of quiet dismissal, President Trump turned his back on Jake Tapper. He simply walked away mid-question. The cameraman, caught off guard, hesitated for a split second before swinging the heavy lens to follow the president, dragging the unwilling interview into uncharted territory. Tapper's face, for a fleeting moment, was a mask of disbelief and fury. His meticulously planned ambush was falling apart. The president stopped before the oldest of the laid-off workers, a man with hands like worn leather and eyes that had seen this factory's birth and its death. He didn't shake his hand for a photo op. He just stood before him, man to man. "They sent him here to talk about numbers," the president said, his voice now booming through the cavernous space, gesturing back toward the stunned anchor. "He wants to talk about metrics. Why don't you tell him your name? Tell him what you built in this place." The old worker, whose name was Frank, looked at the camera, then at the president, and something shifted in his eyes. The resignation was replaced by a flicker of fire. He began to speak. He spoke of his father, who had laid the first bricks of the foundation. He spoke of 47 years spent on this floor, of the pride in seeing steel stamped with the words "made in the USA." He spoke of his son, who he'd hoped would work here, too. One by one, the other men joined in, their voices raw and real, telling stories not of GDP or payroll figures, but of dignity, of community, of betrayal. The president said nothing more. He just stood with them, a silent sentinel, ensuring their voices, not the anchors, were the only ones being heard. He had turned a media interrogation into a national testimonial. The firestorm was immediate and absolute. Before Air Force One's wheels had even touched the tarmac back in Washington, the clip was everywhere. It wasn't just viral, it was elemental. On social media, it was dubbed the walkaway. Memes erupted, Tapper's stunned face with the caption, recalculating. The president standing with the workers, titled The People's Microphone. News channels hailed it as a masterstroke of authentic populist communication. For every pundit praising the move, however, another screamed in outrage. On rival networks, anchors and analysts called it a craven political stunt, a disgraceful and cowardly way to dodge a legitimate question about his economic record. Jake Tapper, later that evening, hosted his own show, his composure regained, but his eyes still holding the sting of public defeat. He framed the incident not as a failure of his interview, but as a dangerous attack on the institution of a free press, an attempt by the president to silence accountability. The narrative war had begun, but the first, decisive battle had already been won in that dusty factory. The cost, however, was private and profound. On the flight home, the adrenaline faded, leaving the president visibly exhausted. He sat alone, staring out the window at the darkening sky, the weight of the fight settling upon him. His son Baron called, his young voice cutting through the political static. He didn't talk about the polls or the media reaction. "I saw what you did, Dad," he said simply. That was for the man in the picture, wasn't it? In that moment, the president's resolve was anchored not in victory, but in family. The threats came just as quickly. In the forward cabin, Mikey Antonetti, the Secret Service agent who had shadowed him for years, a man of few words and unwavering loyalty, quietly handed a slim folder to the chief of staff. It was the overnight threat assessment. The language was sanitized, but the meaning was clear, a significant spike in vile, unhinged emails and voicemails. The cost of poking the hornet's nest was always paid in the currency of violent rhetoric. Late that night, in the quiet solitude of the White House residence, the president stood looking out over the South Lawn. The victory felt distant. The division he stoked, even in the service of a principle he held dear, was a heavy burden. Was the endless fight worth the toll it took on the country, on himself? Mikey stood motionless outside the door, a silent guardian of the president's private war. The next morning, a single unexpected envelope arrived. It wasn't from a donor or a politician. The return address was the local headquarters of a major steelworkers union, a group that had fiercely and publicly opposed him in every election. He opened it. Inside was a handwritten note, the script rough but firm. It read, "Mr. President, I've spent the last 10 years fighting you. But today, you weren't a politician. You were a voice for my members. You gave my people their dignity back on national television. For that, thank you." He read the note twice. The doubt that had clouded his mind evaporated like mist in the morning sun. This was the validation that mattered. Not from the pundits, not from the polls, but from the heart of the very world he was fighting for. He picked up the phone to his chief of staff. "Cancel my afternoon," he commanded, "and get the advance team on the line. I don't want to issue a statement. I want to schedule a visit. Find me another factory, one that's still running. We're going to hold a town hall, no press, just workers. We'll call them factory floor forums." The principle had been tested in the firestorm and had emerged stronger, forged into policy. The moment in Ohio was no longer just a viral clip, it was the beginning of a movement. It had fundamentally shifted the national conversation. Jake Tapper had wanted to talk about the economy in the abstract language of Washington. The president had forced the nation to confront the economy as a deeply personal, human story, measured not in data points, but in the calloused hands and resilient hearts of the American worker. It was no longer about left versus right, but about the seen versus the unseen, the remembered versus the forgotten. In an age of curated sound bites and manufactured outrage, what is the true price of authenticity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for more stories of the moments that define our times, make sure to subscribe.